welcome to BRLSI. It seems that we're a very exclusive and high quality audience here tonight. So congratulations joining such a splendid event. The talk tonight, which I'll introduce in just a moment, is one of a series that we organize in the BRLSI on topics related to sustainable living. Some of these are about practical matters like, recycling plastic, and others are about more general aspects of how we could live sustainable lives, and the talk that we're going to hear this evening is of that kind. But just before we get going on that, I'll just mention that we have a couple of other talks coming up in the near future that you might be interested in. So on the 14th of March, which is that's 8 days from now, there's a talk on how sunlight drives metabolism and delays aging. And if you're interested in that, you can read about it on our website. But I'll just mention that this is really about sustainability too, because it's really a talk about sustainable indoor lighting. And it turns out that the LED lights that we all now have in our homes are actually not so great, it turns out. And then on the 18th of March, we have another talk in this sustainability series about fusion power, from science to electricity, the challenges of generating fusion electricity. I myself feel very skeptical about this altogether, and it's always said that to produce essentially free electricity from nuclear fusion is something that's always 40 years ahead, and it doesn't really seem to get any closer. But given that some of our political leaders would like to believe in fusion energy, if you wanted to know more about it, we'll have a good talk about that. Anyway, this evening, Paul Pivcevic is going to be talking about bioregioning and a flourishing future. And I just asked Paul how he got into this business, and he explained that he started out as a scientist, worked in science journalism, and then got into development, and also into some rather difficult areas of war-torn Europe, and then broadened himself still further by taking up the environmental career that he'd always wanted to do, and eventually came to where he is now, and I'm pretty sure he's going to tell us more about how he got there. So, Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the warm welcome. Good evening. You may have already inferred from the blurb about this talk, I'm not presenting bioregioning as the answer, more as one possible future to interrogate that might reconcile the tensions we face morally, socially, ecologically, and economically. I'm hoping you'll listen to how I draw out these tensions with not too hard a grip on your claim to the truth. For this very human trait to be right, for which we must therefore forgive ourselves, may be just the thing we need to disturb a little if we're to turn the page on our predicament. Some pictures of that predicament. Imagine This was only October last year, the aftermath of floods in Valencia. The water simply unstoppable. This in January in Los Angeles. Not too far-fetched to think the veil of the world slipped for a moment, revealing perhaps in our imaginations a wasteland of Cormac McCarthy proportions, just lying in wait. Not that there's any shortage of places to find confirming evidence that we're heading that way, but why, oh why, we ask, while at the same time wringing our hands over our addiction to the luxuries served up by a globalized economy, even as the climate careers out of control. This is necessarily a world of plucky heroes, of dragon villains breathing fire on the world. With opaque agendas, so we know not where they will strike next. But can it be that simple? How useful is this cartoon map of the world? It might comfort us and leave us secure, if in nothing else, our horror and our judgments. But even though it might feel strangely satisfying to lose ourselves in the world of French satire, can we pause and ask, is there any meaning to discover behind this wrecking ball? For a long time, I found it difficult to perceive any organized thinking, blinded as I've been by the chaos of triggered emotions and hooked on dopamine. In fact, until preparing for this talk got me researching. I remembered the work of Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist. He did some very interesting research in the late noughties into the moral frameworks of liberals and conservatives. He found that far from thinking that we live on different planets, both left and right share a common framework, though they emphasize it differently. Here it is. Reading from left to right. First, harm care. We share a concern for safety and caring for the vulnerable. Next, fairness and reciprocity, that we should have equal rights, that everyone contributes their fair share. In-group loyalty, the third one, that we should favor and support the groups that we identify with. Authority, respect, that there's a need for hierarchy and respect for social order. And purity and sanctity, that we should eschew corruption, including defilement of the body, and live a morally elevated life. Liberals, it turns out, have mostly a two-channel morality. The first two of these are emphasized more than the other three. Conservatives use all five. Here's Haidt's summary of where they differ. Liberals say, let's celebrate diversity, not common group membership. Let's question authority, and they say, keep your laws off my body. Noble motives, perhaps, for traditional authority and morality can be quite repressive and restrictive to women, to those at the bottom, to people who don't fit in. Liberals speak for the weak and oppressed. They want change and justice, even at the risk of chaos. Conservatives, on the other hand, speak for institutions and traditions like the nation state, religion, community, freedom of speech. They want order, even at some cost to those at the bottom. Conservatives remind us, says Haidt, that order is hard won and easily lost. And as I read that, I remember the riots only last summer. In fact, after the chaos of the French Revolution, watching from this country, Edmund Burke, the philosophical founder of conservatism, wrote, "The restraints on men, as well as their liberties, are to be reckoned among their rights." So it seems, however antithetical you might be disposed towards the other side, without both change and stability, we don't seem to have a functioning democracy. Granted, it's a simpler map than the terrain of populist politics we have today, Certainly looking at attitudes to chaos, Musk and Trump are now blurring that boundary. But as you can no doubt see, the dividing lines of today's debates on immigration, abortion, gender, for example, are still clearly visible. But I found this map even more useful watching some of the speeches at a conference held just a few weeks ago in London called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. Among the speakers at this most conservative convention, including Jordan Peterson, the well-known psychologist you can see here, and co-founder of this movement, there was by no means unequivocal support for Trump and Musk. But expressed there were deeply held beliefs, even though to my liberal sensibilities there were uncomfortable undercurrents, tendencies to exclude more than to include, and a curious mixture of imperiousness and fragility. With a pang, I realise I'm a genuinely good fit for Haidt's model. Voices at the conference celebrated almost universally a shared belief in Imago Dei, that we're all made in God's image, so each of us have a profound dignity. Celebrated too the gift of heavenly abundance, which put me in mind of this from Genesis. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." There was also faith at the conference in the creative power of human innovation that's made great strides in alleviating poverty. People were quite clear. Growth is what's needed to keep abundance flowing, and we must continue with that mindset, not the scarcity one that lies behind the degrowth movement, who, they say, would condemn us all to poorer and less interesting lives. More carbon dioxide means more plants and trees too. Yes, there are consequences, but we'll have to learn how to live with those. For these conservatives, the defining inequality in the world is between the electricity rich and electricity poor. 800 million people have no access to electricity at all, as you can see here, mostly in the 54 countries of Africa. The lighter shades refer to where there's electricity wealth, the darker where there's poverty. Tens of millions more use only tiny amounts. In Chad, only enough power is available to boil a kettle once a week. We have to close the gap, say these conservatives, by enabling nations to become self-sufficient in electricity. And let's not forget about our own prosperity, they say. Net zero here in our country makes no economic sense. Renewables need expensive backup when the wind doesn't blow, and it's elitist. It rewards the already wealthy who can afford solar and heat pumps, and it further impoverishes the least advantaged. Electricity costs here are 5 times those in the US. And that, neocons say, is destroying what's left of our manufacturing base. Enabling the poor to better their lot is the only way they can even care about the future. The World Bank seems to support them. Here's a direct quote from its website. "If growth does not accelerate and become more inclusive, it will take decades to eradicate extreme poverty and more than a century to lift people above the poverty line of $6.85 a day." So we've heard about dignity, self-reliance, growth as an answer to both of these, but the conference also insisted on voluntary reciprocal sacrifice. You see in the background of this painting the metaphorical hands of the state standing back and keeping out of it. In the words of Jordan Peterson, we're always giving ourselves up to participation as parts of higher, broader identities within our family units, our communities, our religious communion, our cities, our nations. Beyond particularities, in the full knowledge and compassion for those who don't fit our ideals, to address the growing polarization of identity between the pole of the atomized individual, worshipping particularity, exception, and difference, and a totalizing state holding the ring, protecting fragmented individuals from each other. I hear in these words a yearning for both belonging and for order. He goes on, decisions should always be taken at the lowest possible level, closest to where they'll have their effect, the notion of subsidiarity. Ironic, this echoes a fundamental principle of the European Union, a supranational entity these conservatives feel is beyond a scale you can have a sense of belonging to. So that's one side. The opposite worldview on the other side to Jordan Peterson and his friends is the mindset, of course, of limits, of boundaries. It began with this that I found on my father's bookshelf. Published in 1972, the Limits to Growth report put together by a pioneering research team at MIT, led by the scientist Donella Meadows, warned of the consequences to the planet of continuing business as usual. 50 years later, we see here on the left in the Stockholm Resilience Centre's graphic produced last year the consequences of exactly that. 6 to 9 of the planetary boundaries have been exceeded already. The dashboard is glowing red. In 2017, Kate Raworth made the link between breaking through ecological ceilings and falling through social foundations on housing, water, health, education, and so on. This so-called donut holds within its green ring the safe and just space for humanity. It's clear we'll have no success addressing the ecological issues, she argues, without also addressing poverty and inequality. Not so dissimilar from the neocons, except that the answer here is definitely not growth. But what's the evidence? In Limits to Growth, Dana Meadows and colleagues used a dynamic systems model to look at 4 scenarios, as you see here. Business as usual assumed would continue based on historical averages, and this led to collapse by the middle of this century. The word collapse means a rapid, unmanaged decline rather than cataclysm, although they're pretty close in my mind. Business as usual 2, modelled on using twice as many resources, not surprisingly, also led to collapse. CT, or comprehensive technology, assumed a rate of tech development and adoption at least twice as high as at the time, also led to decline, though not as rapidly. Stabilized World, SW, was modelled on the assumption that we change priorities away from material consumption and industrial growth towards health and education services and a sharp increase in technology to control pollution and make efficient use of our resources. That was 1972. 3 years ago, the models were run again with the latest data. Here are the results. Gaia Harrington, an analyst from KPMG, one of the world's top consultancy firms, doing her master's at Harvard, showed the scenarios were still accurate. If you look top right at business as usual 2, doubling the natural resource use, this is one of the 2 scenarios that aligns best with the empirical data. See the collapse pattern of population and industrial output. The other best fit is bottom left. CT, comprehensive technology, shows a more moderate decline, though not in population, but in both cases, a halt in economic growth is predicted within the next 2 decades. The scenario that depicts the most shallow declines, stabilized world, bottom right, is also the one that aligns least closely with the real world variables. The message, therefore, says Gaia Harrington, is this: look at the timeline. We're at a decision point. It's not yet too late for humankind to change course away from material consumption and industrial growth. That's how we avoid collapse and leave humanity with the highest possible levels of welfare. Therefore, we're left with two seemingly irreconcilable positions. On the one hand, the neocon position that without growth, including growth in fossil fuels, the poorest won't get electricity, their route out of poverty. On the other, precisely the opposite. We must change course and wake up. Material progress is not all it's cracked up to be. Where's the space for a middle way? Well, let's turn back briefly to the Bible, the Judeo-Christian tradition that's the touchstone of the neocon worldview. If there was dominion in Genesis 1, here's Genesis 2. Man here refers to Adam. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. The word work has been pored over by scholars. It's translated from the ancient Hebrew, abad, meaning also cultivate or serve, even worship, if the one being served is God. So if dominion brought us the extractive economy, for all the earth was declared ours to exploit, then why don't we see what cultivating has to offer? How did our earliest ancestors cultivate or serve their garden? What you're looking at here are the waters of British Columbia turned milky white, as they do every springtime, as millions of herring arrive in the kelp forests off the coast. Male herring release their sperm, female fish lay billions of pinhead-sized eggs. Both the eggs and the fish themselves are a critical post-winter food source for animals, from bears to bald eagles, whales to wolves, herons to humans. Crucially, the herring constitute up to 80% of the diet of the keystone species, upon which the whole ecosystem depends. Vast congregations of young Pacific salmon. The first people of the Pacific Northwest took their name from these creatures, their main source of protein. Ceremonies honored their sacrifice to become human food. They observed carefully how the web of life fitted together around the salmon, and so they were drawn to the blooms of herring spawn. And to the rich marine world of the kelp forests, where the herring mated. As they observed the young salmon feeding, it was these forests, they realized, that were the foundation of the whole food chain. When human populations grew and needed more to eat, their answer wasn't simply to go fishing, but to plant more of these forests. Thus, they were feeding all life around them, for all life was regarded their kith and kin. Bears had to eat too. Once caught, the bear would munch on the fish in the forest. On the right-hand side, you see a discarded salmon carcass. In its back, a typical bear bite. They wouldn't take more, for by the time the exhausted fish got upriver, they were riddled with sea lice. Only at the beginning of this century was it discovered that 80% of the nitrogen that fed the growth of the giant trees of these forests came from the salmon merging with the forest floor. Another keystone species, this time in the central plains of North America. It was, of course, the buffalo. On the left, fleeing deliberately set prairie fires. The indigenous scholar Lila June comments, indigenous peoples have intentionally augmented grasslands for buffalo by bringing gentle fire to the Great Plains. For millennia, following the grass-burning moon of our lunar calendars, we would transform dead plant tissue into nutrient-dense ash, nourishing the soil and unlocking the seeds of pyro-adapted grasses and medicines like echinacea. Over time, this fire would prevent trees and shrubs from taking over the grasslands and would nourish the soil to generate topsoils up to 4 feet deep. Many people think that we follow the buffalo, when in fact the buffalo followed our fire. In this manner, we expanded buffalo habitats as far south as Louisiana and as far east as Pennsylvania. To us, fire is now clear. It not only benefited the buffalo, but a whole ecosystem of bird species, rattlesnakes, and prairie dogs. First Nations also learned to mimic young woodland, replacing inedible plants within those young woodlands with edible varieties. These food systems were hitching a ride on nature's most productive ecosystem. Abundance of food resulted from observing which seemed to be the most beneficial relationships between the plants, including relationships that would best ward off pests and attract pollinators. Centuries later, these forest gardens are still multiplying biodiversity. These rich plantings are in Hawaii, which is now rediscovering the ancient way of organizing agriculture around its watersheds. Once self-sufficient in food, Hawaii now imports 85% of its needs. The indigenous food system, called ahupua'a, understood not only that the watershed was one system, for all its waters would lead to the same river, but therefore that everyone should take equal responsibility for the whole of it. Each farmer was allocated a wedge, their very own slice of the watershed, from mountaintop down to the sea. You'd be very aware that whatever you did upstream would, before you knew it, affect all of your neighbours. Terracing was a way to slow the water down, plant diverse crops suitable to the soils, and then the nutrients carried by the river would concentrate in fish ponds, like the one you see on the left, natural fish nurseries with cleverly designed seawalls, so that only young fish could get in or out. Fish would fatten in these pools. Eating was just a matter of dipping in your net. So could these few examples of successful cultivating and serving something bigger than ourselves be an example of growth, but good growth, you could say? But does this mean we should return everyone to an agrarian lifestyle? Do we just plonk a solution like this on the table and then find some sort of compromise that retains as much of what we already have, with both sides finding themselves equally unhappy? Or is there a more sophisticated approach? Can we better understand the potential of the deep divisions in our thinking? Here's Heraclitus, a famous quote from him. He's known for that saying, "You can't step into the same river twice." He left us only intriguing fragments, and one of them was this: "They do not understand how, though at variance with itself, it agrees with itself. It is a backwards turning attunement like that of the bow and the lyre." The point comes out more clearly in Freeman's translation. They do not understand how that which differs with itself is in agreement. Harmony consists of opposing tension like that of the bow and the lyre. So, rather than compromise, Heraclitus suggests that we need to hold both sides of a tension together, so that something genuinely new can enter the world, like the flight of an arrow or a melody from an instrument. Heraclitus wasn't alone. Here's Blake. Without contraries, there's no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. Then Niels Bohr, the quantum physicist who successfully challenged Einstein. It's the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth. And then the poet and scientist Goethe. Dividing the united, uniting the divided is the very life of nature. This is the eternal systole and diastole, the eternal coalescence and separation, the inhalation and exhalation of the world in which we live and where our existence is woven. As I read it, Goethe is saying that if you look deeply enough, opposites are simultaneously present in each other. These were the deeper truths that I discovered lay behind my regenerative practice training in 2019, a core framework of which we look at here, called the Law of Three. Here are two opposing forces that can be reconciled, by which I mean not synthesized or compromised, but harmonized to a higher state. In my work with individuals, it's really useful for holding the discomfort of inner tensions and contradictions, so as to reconcile them to a higher level, a person's next level of their professional practice. It's useful for leaders and their teams too, reconciling restraints that face them in their organizations, so they can make a greater contribution to a wider change effort. Useful with communities too, exploring the potential of their place, restrained by conservation in one direction and the will to evolve in the other. The practice is to stand in and value the deep truth of both and allow a reconciler to emerge. A favourite practical example is the igloo. The restraining force is, I'm so cold I'm going to die. The activating force, I really want to live. So, how can we come up with a living space that only works when it's freezing? A place we can meet, spend time with, and grow our culture. The form of our encounter this evening, a talk, necessarily shortcuts the developmental process, but we're exploring just one possible reconciling force for now, which has the name bioregioning. So I'd invite you to hold this as if it could be a way forward, rather than the answer. Here are some of the groups active in the UK, each of them engaging uniquely in a local dialogue about what bioregional organising might bring. We meet regularly, every 6 weeks or so online. We need to go back in time 50 years to Donella Meadows again. It was this visionary scientist who proposed that every bioregion on Earth establish its own bioregional learning centre to understand how to change course. But what does bioregion even mean? Let's start with a word. The word brings together two parts of language that are mostly separated in our modern world. Bio, as in nature, but embracing all life, including us, and region, the political constructs and boundaries that we place on the natural landscape that often ignore its natural features and the ways that regions work as living systems. Those of us exploring this space express it as bioregioning, the verb, to acknowledge that life isn't static, but always changing and evolving. Bioregioning goes beyond our aim to do less harm, to a way of seeing ourselves in our place as living and thriving alongside all other living entities, no less or more important than any other life, but with a unique role, because we uniquely can see patterns and connections, and therefore how things fit together, like our indigenous forebears. Bioregioning then is a process of learning, even relearning how to live in a particular landscape, a place from which we might draw a sense of belonging, a place, however temporarily, we might call home. Here's a crisper definition from one of the early protagonists, Kirkpatrick Sale, the American author and advocate of decentralism. Oops. It is any part of the Earth's surface whose rough boundaries are determined by natural characteristics rather than human dictates, distinguishable from other areas by particular attributes of flora, fauna, water, climate, soils, and landform, and by the human settlements and cultures those attributes have given rise to. You can hear the invitation for an intense reacquainting with our place. Could bioregioning really become a way of organising our relations, our economy, our public celebrations? Cascadia is the modern inheritor of the Salmon Nation territory. It's one of the longest established bioregions. Its economy, no longer focused exclusively on salmon, takes its name from the connected watersheds of the Columbia, Fraser, and Snake rivers, whose waters cascade down mountains that range from southern Alaska across the border to British Columbia in Canada, down to Idaho, Nevada, Montana, California. 16 million inhabitants in all. The Cascadia organisers have been telling us powerful stories of how this bioregioning focus has evoked a galvanising sense of belonging, building many local food systems, and through collective action, addressing both mitigation and resilience in the face of climate change. In May, they hold their annual celebration day. Because bioregioning breaks out of administrative, even national frameworks, it also misses out on conventional flows of funding. Yet it's surprising how many locally organised and innovative funding mechanisms do exist. Late last year, I completed some research for the South Devon Bioregional Learning Centre on this actual topic. We were particularly curious about funding and financing models, not those that simply built more local wealth, rather those that grew the capacity for ecological and social renewal into the future, which also happened to stimulate the local economy. Regenerative development, in other words. One particular example stood out: a bond to raise money to regenerate this, Canada's most fragile bioregion in southwestern Ontario, the so-called Carolinian Zone, home to 30% of Canada's species at risk and 25% of its population. The Carolinian Zone is the ancient land of the Deshkan Zibi, translated as those who belong to the Antler River. In 2022, the Deshkan Zibi Conservation Impact Bond won the UK, this sounds really boring, but actually quite important, won the UK Institute of Chartered Accountants Finance for the Future Climate Leader Award. What shone out to the judges was not the elegance of the financial model, but the organising principle behind its design, that we must restore our relationships with each other and with the land for long-term success. Just a quick look at five relational outcomes. Reading from bottom left clockwise. Connecting healthy habitats. So this was measured by how many native plants were connected, or planted rather, because if you restore the native plants and their relationships, the biodiversity will restore itself. Connecting knowledge. This was a measure of how successfully the project integrated traditional ecological knowledge with Western conservation science. Connecting opportunities there at the top, a measure of how many jobs and how many opportunities were created for jobs and businesses to emerge, like plant nurseries. Connecting our hearts and minds. Did people's stories about participating in the project show a deeper understanding and appreciation for the interconnection of human and non-human and a sense of responsibility for the land? Connecting our bodies, what was reported as impact on people's health and well-being, and so on, with all those benefits that we know well about. Notice, though, no financial metrics at all. Nature was not to be made into another asset class. The bond would pay out only on reaching at least one key metric within each outcome. It was capitalised largely by investors with local relationships, people themselves who cared for their place. But here's the key point. The bond drew on two fundamentally different worldviews. The Western Enlightenment science paradigm, first brought by the European settlers who arrived in Canada from the 17th century onwards, and the regenerative mindset of the First Nations, the locals, whose lands they sought to colonise. At that time, these worldviews were commemorated in this artefact. The two purple rows symbolising two paths or two vessels travelling down the same river. One row, the first peoples with their laws and customs, the other, European laws and customs. As nations moved together side by side along the river of life, they're to avoid overlapping or interfering with one another, and yet they become a greater whole that includes both. A coincidence of opposites, perhaps, the reconciling force being that of peace. Known in this region as two-eyed seeing, it became core to how the Bond's leadership team made decisions. Whatever measure of success best served the health of the whole would always win out. But both eyes would be heard, so to speak. The Bond is already in its third round, the next phase aiming to raise a further $2 million. It's inspired the South Devon bioregion such that they want to set up their own mechanism, a trust to flow in money based around similar principles to this bond. Here's another answer to Dana Meadows' far-sighted insight about bioregional learning centres. Another hat I wear is a director of a community benefit society called Wilden in the Forest of Dean. We are part of the evolving story of the forest, a place between three rivers, the Severn, the Wye and the Leedon. It's an edge place, sometimes forgotten, against the ancient boundary between England and Wales. And yet, having always been a working forest, it's a place whose people and natural resources have from time to time played a central role in the story of the whole country. You could add the wider world too, for the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution was here in the lower Wye Valley. We have the backing of one of a number of large foundations which are beginning to turn their attention to bioregioning work. In our case, it's help with the purchase of an iconic outdoor learning centre, the Wilderness Centre. I'm happy to report that the heads of terms are being drawn up next week. It's a place I've been supporting for the last 4 years on its journey to become a regenerative business, wilding 32 acres with animals, including wild boar, Dartmoor ponies, hardy cattle, in order to enhance the educational offer to the schools and other visitors. Biodiversity is blooming as a result. Like our indigenous ancestors, our visitors are realizing that we humans have a role in making nature more abundant. We also have 5 acres of old growth forest, which we're talking to Forestry England about, as an outdoor classroom for new uses of timber, as well as learning how to manage woodland in ways that regenerate the forest rather than deplete it. Construction with wood is sure to be a key material for the future, and new technologies are coming on stream. We'd like to take up the role the local council would like to see us play as a community-wide eco-literacy centre, supporting their vision for a circular, regenerative and distributive local economy. So, could the Forest of Dean once again be the birthplace of an economic revolution, but more in tune with its landscape, whereas prosperity is also more equally shared? And while we're on the topic of wealth inequality, I wonder whether it's just so much simpler to grasp this nettle at a local scale. To that end, in a couple of weeks' time, local businesses are coming to us to use Kate Rayworth's donut to rethink the design of their businesses, to explore if they can make a bigger contribution to local flourishing by questioning their ownership models. So, I'm now going to pause and ask you to turn your attention inwards for a moment. Connect to breath and to body, and listen to the description of 2 opposing impulses I'm about to describe, and the worlds they conjure up. See if you can stay with both, as if both have value. You might close your eyes if you feel comfortable. One force, the activating force, is towards growth. A growing economy with energy costing much less because we're using all the resources of the earth, oil, gas, nuclear, wind, solar, that creation has made available. No homes are cold. Prosperity is more evenly distributed across the world. Volunteering has become the responsibility of each of us for the sake of stronger communities, and that sacrifice brings pride in belonging to wider and wider identities. Ultimately, pride in our country. In faraway places, Electricity is lighting up homes which have never had light before. The very poor are dignified through inclusion. And hopefully they can better their lot. There are more climate events, but at least our increased wealth across the world affords us stronger defences and doesn't push huge numbers into boats. The other impulse is a restraining force towards frugality, living responsibly on a limited planet, buying less, growing more of our food, bearing the cost of change, denying ourselves the conveniences and luxuries of globalized modernity, assuming government will ensure the equality of jobs and warm homes as we move towards a greener economy, slicing away at our emissions, trusting that offsets will be exchanged for more biodiversity, cleaner air, cleaner rivers, a world, if less prosperous, then a stabler world, respectful of our planet's limits, not ravaged by increasing flood, fire and storms. Let's test then if bioregioning could be a successful reconciler. Imagine living within a landscape at a scale you could call home, a land with a shared and living story that you feel part of, a community that you and your neighbours gladly give time to, a piece of the world of a scale you can hold in mind so that you can perceive both its needs and its potential. Imagine it's a land we nourish to provide us with as many of our needs as it can, while stewarding nature to be even more abundant as we enable it to adapt to a changing climate. It's a place you can cherish such that you care to ask, what's my role in serving this whole to flourish, all life, not just human life? Knowing all the while that your region also has a higher contribution to make to a wider system, a bigger watershed, ultimately to the country. So you're never turned inwards to your exceptionalism, individual or collective. In fact, you're participating as much in a spiritual as a material project. And you find different ways to celebrate this. Perhaps your bioregioning also twins you with another region with a story you share in a poorer part of the world. You don't prosper unless they do too. And while the economy may be growing very slowly, if at all, wealth is more equally shared because businesses are not looking for quick exits and owners have rethought who is creating wealth. An abundance of nature together with new technologies is ushering in a new kind of economy, the lessons of which become a knowledge commons to be shared. So, could bioregioning reconcile the politics of both left and right, so that the world is growing in all the ways that bring us meaning, even while it's not growing much at all? At the moment, I work elsewhere, but I live here in Bath. I've spent the last 2 years walking, cycling, and swimming the length of the river, Avon, and walking all over the watershed. I've pulled together a group of people interested in bioregioning here, which taught me particularly a lot about the social challenges of our city. But I've been bewildered by a diverse landscape and puzzled over what might make it a whole system in my mind. And then it came to me, moments before I was about to give a talk a few months ago in Bristol. My mind turned to our waters. Here's a map from the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust of our watershed. I call this the waters of the Avon. Here's another what if. What if our community, what if each community, householders, farmers, businesses, landowners around each of these watercourses self-organised to govern their patch, their commons, so to speak, and was funded to do so? Developed their vision for flourishing, decided what data to collect to monitor progress, whether the warmth of homes, access to affordable food, water quality, sightings of wildlife. For after all, everyone's water ends up downstream in our shared Avon. What if an annual festival had competitions for whose local food was best, but best was judged by how well it fed all life, not just us. What if all communities were accountable to a symposium of our waters, a gathering of us all, and this symposium brought together our our story keepers to help us weave a shared story across the region and inspire us with a unique vocation, the contribution only we can make to the wider Southwest. Embracing into our story also our bioregioning twin, a region located in a part of the world perhaps where our exported brass centuries ago brought this greatest sorrow. The goal of the economy would be wealth, but where the meaning of this ancient word reverted back to its root wheel, in English meaning, an Old English meaning, well-being for all. Would we be proud then to say that we belong to the waters of the Avon? Just 3 more slides to close. This quote from Karl Paul Polanyi, a Hungarian-British academic, is in Molly Scott Cato's book, this one, The Bioregional Economy. Even before the end of the Second World War, he was already trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. Market society was born in England, and yet it was on the continent that its weaknesses engendered the most tragic complications. In order to comprehend German fascism, we must revert to Ricardian England. The 19th century, as cannot be overemphasized, was England's century. The Industrial Revolution was an English event. Market economy, free trade, the gold standard were English inventions. These institutions broke down in the 20s everywhere. Ricardian, I find out, refers to David Ricardo, MP, the influential classical economist of the 19th century, a believer in the power of free trade to increase well-being. Molly's response is this: the economic history of England places on its academics and intellectuals a particular authority matched by a particular responsibility. While our elites and their apologists created a market system that has oppressed millions and devastated the planet, their radical opponents inspired democratic revolutions and the social responsibility for universal welfare. The courage to imagine better futures is bred in the bone of our country, as truly as is the engineering imagination of which we're so proud. Another coincidence of opposites, perhaps, though admittedly seen through a green lens. Molly was, of course, an elected Green, a former MEP for this region. But if we attribute such courage to both sides of politics, then this is quite the rallying cry for our country. You'll be the judge as to whether bioregioning is worth pursuing as a better future. If you're interested in action, I'm planning with like minds a conference later this year to inspire the funding of bioregioning, building on and embracing initiatives like We Are Avon. I'll leave you simply with a poem by way of closing from Rainer Maria Rilke. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing, embody me. Flare up like a flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. Thank you.
Are you happy to do some,
Yes,
take some questions?
for sure.
I'm going to insist on something that's very tedious here. Actually, we have some people listening they won't be able to hear our questions if you don't speak them into the microphone. So it's very annoying, particularly when there aren't very many of us, to have to use the microphone. But that's why I'd like you to speak your question. So, who would like to start with a question for Paul? I'll start with a question. Well, there were a lot of things about your talk that interested me very much, and we might come back to. I myself lived in Seattle for quite a long time, so I was very familiar with the case study that you started with. But let's go straight to a rather practical point. Paul, you are, I think, making a case for government funding to facilitate the kind of regional and societal change that you're talking about. And I just wondered if you would like to comment on the relevance of the changes which are now coming to pass in agricultural funding, for everybody's benefit here. In the past, we're probably going back over a period of about 50 years, particularly over that period while Britain was a member of the European Union. It was felt to be appropriate to encourage farmers to farm by giving them payments that were related to the area of land that they farmed. And this is now thought to be an inappropriate way of going about the nation's farming business. We might talk more about that if we find it to be an interesting topic, but this is not party politics. This is actually something that's been coming on for about a decade now. There's been a movement away from area-based funding towards funding which is directed towards ecological ends. And there's a new system called ELMS. And this is basically about landscape reconstruction, redirection, and farmers will be encouraged to submit plans to redevelop land use to aims which are not so closely allied to food production and more about landscape regeneration. So I've been talking for rather a long time here, but I wanted to explain that. So my question to you, Paul, is this ELMS funding something that is actually quite closely allied to what you're talking about, or are there problems? Yeah.
Thank you. What I understand of ELMS is that, as you say, it incentivizes farmers to bring more biodiversity to their land. I think the bigger question for me is engagement. So if we subdivide communities, fragment them into constituencies in the way that policy does, in a sense, what we're doing is we're fragmenting natural wholes. You know, the concept of a bioregion, if you like, in which we bioregion as a verb, is one which holds everything together. And so the relationships on the land between people who use the land, people who benefit from the land, they're layered and complex. So in a way, it's sort of privatizing to the farmers the care of land, whereas actually we should all be doing that. And so for me, this wider context, or setting it into a wider context, is a more powerful story. Brings us all into a shared responsibility for taking care of the land, educating us, building our capability and capacity to do something about it, learning from farmers, for example. So that part for me is really missing.
Interestingly enough, I think DEFRA agrees with you, and the ELMS funding comes in a number of levels. It remains to be seen how the money will be doled out at these different levels. The lowest level is indeed for field by field ecological aims, but there are successive layers of funding on larger landscape level projects. And it sounds like I'm doing a bit of hand waving here. It's because I believe that actually this is a work in progress, and there are a number of schemes which are currently being considered by DEFRA for quite large-scale projects in which the landscape transformation schemes will encompass the work of large numbers of farmers who have to sign up to them. The trouble is, apparently, that DEFRA is adopting a kind of natural selection process to find out how to do it. And so, for example, there is quite a large project being put together in Wiltshire at the moment, covering more or less the whole of West Wiltshire. It's not certain that it will be considered acceptable, but I think that this is something that you bioregioning people should really be looking at very closely.
Right.
Because if it works, it's pretty much what you're asking for.
Right, right. That sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
I think, the additional thing that bioregioning might bring is a sense of a common story, and if people of West Wiltshire see them as the inhabitants of West Wiltshire, and that there is that narrative, if you like, that binds them to that particular part of the land, of the country, then I think that's a really powerful, motivator for engaging.
So, Paul, I wanted to ask a bit more about the rivers of the Avon bioregion, and it seemed to me, looking at that map, it looked a bit sort of arbitrary. Can you explain why it's demarcated where it is? Why, southern border, it doesn't encapsulate.
Oh, I see.
It doesn't include Wells and Glastonbury. I see that they're just outside it, and it doesn't include Swindon. Is that Swindon there? So I don't know, is that because those are the major kind of confluences? And
well,
that if where do you, in other words, where do you stop?
Yeah.
And the other question I have is really about the interplay between urban and rural communities, and the the connections between people and nature, because I think that's quite a big part of bioregioning, isn't it?
Just say a bit more about the connection between the urban and rural.
Well, how, I think I'm talking about the economy, the urban economy, the rural economy, and how we will develop a more indigenous economy, because as I understand from you,
Yeah.
that's going to be an important part of a bioregion. We will make more of our own things, we'll grow more of our own food, and there'll be a greater sort of sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So let me take the first one, or the first part of it anyway. The map is of the watershed. So in a sense, that's kind of dictated by the geography. So in a way, those are the sort of ridges from which, water starts to fall downwards, broadly speaking. So it's gravity, really. It's a picture of gravity in a way that takes the water down towards the River Avon. So that's why it's drawn in that way. So my sense of it would be that every community, is organised around its watercourses, because in a way we can see that as being a part of the whole. Now, it's not going to ever be as neat as that, because the city of Bristol is much bigger. They've got Bath as another city, plenty of towns and so on. But it's part of a process of organising the governance of a wider space. And within that process of organising our governance is to also discover our role. What's Bath's unique role in relation to the wider bioregion? What should it be concentrating on? Because that's what it uniquely does best. One of the roles that we explored in our group, our bioregioning group, really was, and it's a pretty obvious thing because it's evident to us all every weekend from the people that come here. People come for rest and recreation, for well-being, for spiritual uplift, depending on which activity they engage in. So it's really kind of finding out the story of each of these places and what they uniquely can contribute. But organising the governance around water was simply one way of looking at how can we, feel as though we have a common sense of belonging to a fairly large, diverse landscape, and therefore through that common sense of belonging and organising, have a significant impact on raising nature to a new level, growing its abundance, orientating our economy more towards nature, and in that way, growing in a good way, rather than, growth, the industrial growth that takes us towards collapse.
Perhaps what you're saying, Paul, is what we need are ways to recognise the factors that make us feel part of a functioning community. I was telling you just before the talk began that I live in the Mendips. Actually, just at the edge of your watershed map here. It's a commonplace for people who live in Somerset that Taunton, which is where the centre of Somerset County government is, has very little interest in that part of Somerset that lies on the other side of the watershed. This has been going on certainly for the past 40 years, all the time that I've lived there. People constantly complain that the Somerset County Council in Taunton has no insight into what happens in Frome, Weston-super-Mare, and so on. And so I think what we're feeling our way towards here is that you're suggesting that our local government ought to pay more attention to the way that people feel about the landscape in which they live.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
And maybe some of the regions that we have are simply too big.
For sure. And, I mean, the story I tell about the waters of the Avon really comes from an encounter I had just before I gave a public talk. And someone stopped me, where I was just going to use the loo before I started the talk. And this woman said, well, where are you going? What are you doing? And I explained. And she said, well, what's bioregioning? And I said, well, what region do you think you live in? And she said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, it's WECA, West of England Combined Authority. She said, what on earth's that? I said, okay, well, that to one side. What if we called it Waters of the Avon? And she said, oh, I can go with that. And it's that simple connection. She touched her chest that way. So it's almost as though the land and the body are one, they're connected. And refinding that connection is a very, very powerful thing towards change. And I think, this is the process that we as regenerative practitioners offer in communities called Story of Place. It's a process of mining, the deep patterns that we get through geology, hydrology, social history, ecology, migrations and so on, to see what patterns are really defining a place. Not for the sake of, keeping it in aspic, but more about understanding what is its potential, what is its unique role now. And that's what we're doing in the forest. We've discovered that there are pioneers who've always come to the forest, developed its technologies, started the Industrial Revolution, really self-reliant folk. Now, how can we, remind people or get people to help remind themselves through looking at that story and see where that takes them in terms of what's the next chapter and how do they act into that next chapter? Thank you.
Thank you. I just wondered, in all the sort of research that you've done, whether anything is becoming clear around new models of leadership or thinking about leadership, because I think we can all see that, if you like, the old models have failed. So, tying into all of this, which is, quite inspirational on one level, how ultimately do you feel it might be led? If that makes sense.
Yes. It's interesting, Stuart and I had a brief conversation about this before we started. There are often two ways in which people tend to split the sort of leadership idea, that it all comes from the bottom. It's got to be grassroots and community-led, and that's very much the sort of fashion of it. And it's anti kind of top-down, right? And it is very much this coincidence of opposites. It's very much maps against exactly that, right? The liberal and the conservative. And it's having both. It's seeing a place for both, and seeing a place for, being able to take decisions and make a move, but at the same time, opening space for emergence. Both of those are absolutely essential. I think that's what, the fact that we are living more and more in a polarized world means that we're forced into separation, whereas we realize actually we need both of those poles, and that's got to reflect itself in our leadership as well, I would say.
I'd like to ask how we can get involved. How would you like people to get involved? How can people help?
Well, thanks for that question. I think, there are a number of people interested in bioregioning. So I am absolutely kind of open and willing to join anybody who's already doing it, or indeed for us to organise together the next step, if you like, and what does it mean for here? One of the things that I already did with a colleague of mine, who actually was one of the co-founders of this bioregioning group, in Bath was to make a suggestion to the council that we look at a story of Bath as a place. And it was, batted away because there isn't any money for that kind of thing. And they didn't really, I don't think, understand the spirit of it, what we were trying to get at, which was, what's the vocation of this place in the context of this, wider region. So, I mean, one way is to, if you're interested in, the story of Bath, and I don't mean the kind of high-level kind of myths that people talk about, or the particularities of certain historical incidents. It's more about the deep patterning of this city and what is its responsibility now in relation to the challenges that face us socially and ecologically. So let's do something together is what I would suggest. Meet again and take it to the next step and see which of these ideas inspire us, challenge us, and take it from there.
Problem that I see with the approach that you're trying to tell us about here is that quite a lot of our own ideas about who we are and our place in the landscape is historical. I think that perhaps in the past, people's ideas about who they were very much more founded on what they did for a living, what they spent their days doing, where the money came from. And so the region described on your map in the Middle Ages was very largely about water power, very large number of water mills on fast-flowing rivers. Froome is a very common name for a river. It means a fast-flowing river, ideal for water mills. And the whole region on your map here was really defined by the woolen industry of the Middle Ages, not because the sheep were here, they were somewhere else, but the wool came here and was processed in those mills, and that's where the money came from. Many people would have had very close connections with all of that. So it makes good sense economically in the Middle Ages. The trouble is that if we always look backwards to where we've come from, it may not be very helpful in our thinking about what we need to do next to adapt to a world that appears to be changing. Perhaps it's changing because of our foolish things that we've done, but if we're constantly trying to keep what we've got and think about where we have come from, maybe that's not very helpful. Perhaps you have an answer to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. We certainly wouldn't want to go back to wool, not in the way that it was done before, because sheep are so destructive to the environment. I mean, I'll give you the example of the forest again. What I didn't say, on the grounds of the centre that we are in the process of buying, are these 5 acres of old-growth forests, which we're talking to Forestry England about. There are now some very interesting new technologies coming in that actually blend laminates from different woods together on site. So I think, and because wood's going to be such a hugely important construction material for the future, it's absolutely vital we look at technology in relation to wood, but so that it also supports how a forest can regenerate. So it's not denying technology or denying not having to go back to water mills per se, but seeing where can these tools enable regeneration, so that you don't get architects asking, I want this particular laminate, and then, the person who has to go and sources it, rather asking the question, what does this forest need to regenerate, and what can I then use from that forest, and what can technology help me use, so that we can both satisfy our need for homes, buildings, and so on, but also for nature to keep growing and evolving.
Another way in which we all feel a part of the place in which we live is actually about building materials.
Yeah.
Here, in most of this region, houses are built of stone. That's actually something that doesn't happen all over the UK. It makes us feel that we're at home when we're living in our stone-built huts. So perhaps it's about a bit more than just water. Perhaps it's also about geology.
For sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look, we can, this is only a one as if, it's an offering as to how can we think of wholes rather than think of fragmented parts, such that we can have greater impact, So I agree, yeah, building materials is definitely another. I mean, particular keystone species. I mean, like, it was much easier for the people of the Pacific Northwest. I mean, they had the salmon, or the buffalo on the Great Plains. We don't depend on food systems in that particular way, but there's no reason why we shouldn't begin to understand our ecology better. That we, deeply understand, how does it actually work? How can we create, as we are in the wilderness centre in the forest, hedgerows, so that dormice and pine martins and other little creatures can get across what we are in effect, which is a break in the forest canopy. How do we create conditions for wildlife to thrive? And who knows what emerges from that kind of awareness? We can't predict the future, but if we can get more connected, then I think that's a rich vein of possibility.
I'm not seeing any online questions here on the chat. So I think probably the best thing to do here, if there are no more questions here, will be to call a halt to the proceedings. And I'd like to thank you very much, Paul. It's been a really very thought-provoking presentation. Actually, you've given us all a lot to think about. The challenges that face us as humans in the next 50 years are probably unparalleled in the history of the human species. And we're going to need to be able to think laterally. And this is certainly one of the dimensions that I think we need to be thinking. So thank you.
Thank you so much.